Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Jaligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, and send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm is a locally owned cooperative specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week, we're really pleased to feature Scott conducting an interview with author and activist William C. Anderson about his new book, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition, which is out now from AK Press. In this interview, they speak about the book and its many facets, and black anarchism more broadly, some of the failures of euro-centric and white anarchism, and many, many more topics. If you'd like to see more of Anderson's work, you can visit williamcanderson.info/blog. To see his books, The Nation on No Map and As Black as Resistance, you can visit akpress.org and search his name. And check out our prior presentation by Mr. Anderson about As Black as Resistance, recorded at the Another Carolina Anarchist Book Fair just a few years back on our website.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a fly!
If you've been listening to The Final Straw for a while, you may remember that back in 2019, I took some shots at Noam Chomsky. We had a beef. I like to think it was mutual, like some of the epic beefs between like Tupac and Biggie, or Eminem and ICP, or Taylor Swift and Katy Perry. I'd like to think. My issue then was that Chomsky is something of a poser. He's something of an ANO, anarchist in name only. He never goes on anarchist media, like The Final Straw, for example, but he never misses a chance to pontificate on lefty liberal outlets or hierarch venues like the United Nations. In 2019, I called Chomsky a fart bag and said his ponderous books were good for nothing but throwing in front of Israeli tanks to stop them from bulldozing Palestinian homes. I expected a considerable backlash, as Noam Chomsky is like a revered icon, the anarchist intellectual. But, surprisingly, by an overwhelming consensus, the Final Straw feedback was summed up as, yeah, Noam Chomsky. So irresponsible of you. You had to know that would only embolden me. This past week, Chomsky appeared on Democracy Now! In an hour-long interview with hosts Amy Goodman and Narmeen Sheikh. He's 93 now, sporting a beard that would rival Bakunin, and a decidedly unrevolutionary worldview that would not rival Bakunin. And so, my latest drive-by on Chomsky begins. For the hour-long interview he did on Democracy Now! Rather than The Final Straw, Amy Goodman repeatedly introduced Chomsky as a political dissident. Political dissident, not an anarchist. In fact, for the part of the interview where I could stay awake, I didn't hear the word anarchist once. It seems peculiar to me that the world's foremost anarchist intellectual avoids the A word as much as possible. Quite curious. If you're listening, Noam, just a reminder, you're an A word. That means two things. The interview followed the same general schedule of topics normally taken up by liberal Democrats. The COVID crisis and the global ramifications, how Biden has continued the Trump foreign policy, packaged just a bit more optics friendly, and how Biden has been a real disappointment in some very critical ways, including, notably, his failure to properly respond to climate change. And, just to point out, in Chomsky's presentation of this, he reveals just what a poser he really is. For Chomsky, the solution must be a mobilized effort comparable to the civil rights and women's rights movements. A groundswell of populist, pacifist protests, vocal and public advocacy, forming of voting blocs to get the right government we need to address these crises effectively. Chomsky didn't mention riots or tipping cop cars or widespread sabotage of major corporations that destroy our world, or political violence, or an end to this failed system of artificially fabricated nation states. No. The solution is 1 million people marching in Washington and singing Joan Baez tunes while strumming acoustic guitars. I could be wrong. I think we tried that. I think we have tried that over and over again. So despite Chomsky's otherwise astute analysis in international matters, he seems to have a blind spot, the same blind spot shared by all lefty liberals. And that blind spot begins in 1970 and continues through today. And to Chomsky's defense, it's somewhat understandable that he would be stuck in the solutions of the 1960s. Chomsky was 41 in 1969, the year I was born. So the 60s are right in his political developmental wheelhouse. It makes sense that he would be all for the 1960s people power solutions. The problem is they don't work, and they won't work. The 1960s led us to the 70s, 80s, and on to today. Where are we at regarding all the issues that popular movements confronted back in the 60s? They protested and mobilized against the Vietnam War. Since then, we've had half a dozen more Vietnams, some more tragic than others, the last one just ending in Afghanistan. The U.S. spends more on the military death machine than the next 12 countries combined. They protested against segregation and racism. Show me a year since then where black men shot more cops than cops shot black men. Exactly. The same goes for the environment. The book Silent Spring came out in that era, giving birth to the environmental movement. We're still on pace for omnicide before the next commercial break. There's a common magical bean approach taken by the liberal lefties, a false mythology that all social problems can be solved if enough people gather in one place and say, "Excuse me, I don't think I like this." That government will panic and seek to be responsive and change their low-down ways. It's a fairy dust solution. It's never worked. The week before George W. carpet-bombed a huge chunk of Afghanistan for the first time, more than 1 million people marched in New York City alone. He didn't care what the American people think. They didn't vote for him anyway. And that's why we need a real anarchist perspective, not the Chomsky variety that thinks government can change and be a force for good. Government has never been an instrument of popular will, a tool for our collective betterment. It's always been a weapon to keep us under control. It doesn't respond to protests, to millions sniveling at the same time. Government doesn't care unless you challenge it in a concrete way. The example I love to point to is the September 11 attacks. Prior to September 11, no president ever mentioned a two-state solution to the conflict in Palestine. Just 24 hours after those planes smacked into those buildings, the president announced the policy of pursuing a two-state solution. However you feel about it, this demonstrates that radical violence yields radical change. Violence is provably the language of governments. Speak it, and they can hear you. Sad but true. So this 1960s Chomsky reformist approach does us a great disservice, misdirecting us toward failure at a critical juncture where a burning planet requires us to rethink our resistance strategies while there's still time. if there's still time. But again, if you check him out at democracynow.org, Chomsky's beard is really impressive. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the super duper uber mega hyper ultra turbo multi maxi max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
The state of Ohio seems to be stalling in the process of interstate transfer of Sean away from his spouse, lawyer, and main support base, which is good news. Please check the show notes for more details on how to support his struggle to stay in Ohio. You can also still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. Psst. You can Cash App $Swaniac 1969 or send dough to us and comment that it's for Swain's defense. More info is also available on Instagram at Swaniac 1969 or Twitter at SwainRocks.
So I'm very excited to get to talk to William C. Anderson today, whose new book, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition, was just published by AK Press. Thank you so much for spending the time to talk to me today. If you want, can you just first introduce yourself with your pronouns and any kinds of affiliations or background that you would want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, my name's William C. Anderson. I am a writer, activist, and just a person from Birmingham, Alabama. And my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm really excited to be on the show with you today. I'm happy to be talking with you.
Likewise, and I think this book is a really important contribution. So I want to just delve into it. In the book, you're locating Black anarchism sort of as a practical development in revolutionary action, both in the history of movement work, but also I think individually, like in the kind of individual consciousness. And I think that's a super helpful intervention and contribution, kind of like thinking about our history and also strategizing for the future. So I want to talk about like both of the moments, kind of like movement stuff and then individual stuff. And also, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate that the book is like clearly grounded in your own experience, and it doesn't seem like that kind of top-down theorizing that often happens. And I'm thinking sometimes of like ways that like white leftists and anarchists use Afro-pessimist texts to talk about Blackness without it being kind of sort of grounded in movement work. But so, okay, first, what do we mean by Black anarchism? I see you kind of using this in relationship to the legacy of the Black liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. And I just want to use this quote because I think it's really important. You say Black anarchism is a breakaway from the revolutionary Black power movement as opposed to simply being an effort to diversify or revise classical anarchism. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this development in Black revolutionary thinking and why it often gets overlooked for the kind of different ways that the Black power movement gets represented.
Well, this really all starts with Martin Sostre introducing Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin to anarchism in 1969 in federal detention in New York. So Lorenzo was a Maoist who fled to Cuba after hijacking a plane, where he was imprisoned alongside other Black radicals who were fleeing during that time. And he was essentially deported to Czechoslovakia, where he was imprisoned again. And then he fled to East Germany, where the federal authorities caught up with him. He was fleeing originally to Cuba because he had, these trumped up charges against him. And it was a frame up for being accused of threatening to bomb a KKK judge. And so he had decided to flee. And again, he goes to Cuba, he's imprisoned there. He goes to Czechoslovakia, he's detained there. He flees to East Germany and he's detained again. And he's tortured in East Germany too. And he is sent to New York, and in federal detention, he is clearly upset by his experience with these state socialist governments he had gone to looking for safe haven. And so with that frustration, he meets Martin Sostre, who is a famous political prisoner at the time. And, he's an imprisoned intellectual, and he's a jailhouse lawyer who was repeatedly suing the prison system and actually creating new reforms and gaining new rights for imprisoned people through his lawsuits. He completely transforms conditions almost single-handedly through his litigation. And so he's talking to Lorenzo about his frustrations, and he tells him there is more than state socialism. And he tells him it's not the only form of socialism. He tells him about stateless or libertarian socialism, which we know as anarchism. And Lorenzo starts doing the reading. And a decade later, he writes Anarchism and the Black Revolution. And that really is the real start of this development in many ways. And so other former Panthers and members of the Black Liberation Army are also becoming interested during this period. And they're all thinking about their frustrations within the Black Power movement, with the Black Panther Party, with Marxist-Leninism, with Maoism, et cetera. And they're all writing and moving accordingly and asking questions. And so I don't think that you can exactly place a location and a time on the birth of Black anarchism, because I don't like to think about history in that way. I think that history is a lot more complicated than trying to place official stamps on things. But that's really a great way to think about its beginnings with Martin and Lorenzo. And you can also complicate that a little bit more if you want to bring in someone like Lucy Parsons, who was, obviously doing a lot of writing and speaking about anarchism much earlier, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And, this is a formerly enslaved Black woman. But I think what makes a person like Lucy distinct is also that her relationship to her Blackness and to race was a bit more complicated. And so when we're thinking about Black anarchism, we're really thinking about this breakaway from the Black Power movement in terms of questioning and disturbing this idea that revolutionary Black nationalism and state socialism together were the only solutions in terms of ways to think about pursuing Black liberation.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I like how you're grounding it also specifically in like the material conditions, like the people in the moment were like, this, we need something else to look towards. But, also the way that you frame it in your book, you're saying that they're not just kind of like taking on European anarchism, but actually you make this really, I think, telling statement that Black anarchism represents a failure of the anarchist movement in terms of like the European tradition of anarchism. And, I have my understanding of this as sort of like, what you also talk about in the book is like Black anarchism isn't like a kind of diversity and inclusion effort of a kind of white anarchism or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's actually a critique of anarchism that Black anarchism delivers. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you see as the failure of European anarchism and then how a Black anarchism would add what you call precision. I really like that word.
Yeah, I could talk about this all day, but I think that, well, for me, historically, I think European anarchists have been self-involved and focused on how they were / are, right about the nature of the state in a way that actually limited their appeal. And so I think that it may be arguable that state socialists were much more effective and thoughtful about bringing Black people and oppressed people of the world into their efforts. Now, that's not to say that Black people were not met with hostility for bringing up historically what's known as the race question or, the Negro question. There were certainly confrontations that had to be had around race and class that required Black Marxists to challenge conventional white state socialisms and Marxism. So I consider actually those efforts part of the legacy of Black autonomous radicalism too. That's why I draw from an autonomous Marxist like C.L.R. James in my writing. So classical anarchism was not as effective in wrestling with that, and it didn't develop in the same way. Now, there's also the factor of the Russian Revolution and other revolutions that were claimed by state socialists. That global impact can't be ignored in terms of influence. So all of that has to be considered. But Black anarchism isn't a diversity effort or an effort for inclusion because it draws influence from the experiences that precede it. So Lorenzo was a former Maoist. Martin was a nationalist, former Black nationalist, member of the Nation of Islam. Ojore Lutalo had been wrestling, with Marxism before Kuwasi Balagoon brings him to anarchism. So they didn't completely discard classical anarchism. Lorenzo, for example, revises it in a way that we can observe parallels the way that Marxism is revised in the Black radical tradition. So what makes it so special is that Black anarchism does that with Marxism too. Now that's important. That's an important thing to know. It does that with Marxism, with Black nationalism, and with anarchism. So in my opinion, because of the way it challenges all of those forms, it transcends the left almost entirely, and it rises above conventional leftism. And that makes it special. And that's how I'm reading it in this book. It is one of the only places on the left where this sort of confrontation happens in so many ways, and these revisions happen in so many ways that it actually creates something transformative that shows us how to rise above conventional historical leftisms and dogma and orthodoxy, and to think about creating something completely new. And I think that that's really beautiful. That's why I'm so just blown away by the writings of Black anarchists and the thinking and the way that they were approaching the left and the way that they were approaching Black power and thinking beyond. I think that that's a beautiful example.
Yeah, what you just said makes me think of this line you have towards the end of the book, which I guess I'll just read it if you don't mind. Talking about Black anarchism, it looks at the whole of history and works to uproot oppression by asking the most basic questions about what power is and what gives anyone the right to control or oppress others, even those we share space with. The question is simple, but its implications are vast, influencing the totality of our lives from race to gender to class and all of the many aspects of existence into which power insinuates itself. And I thought about that when you were saying, because when you're talking about these basic, it's a simple, basic questions about our life that anarchism is addressing, but it has this more expansive vision in a way than other approaches. And I thought that was really helpful. And what you said resonated a lot with that to me. And in a way, I guess I'm having a question come up for me. So I look to Black feminist writings and I see versions of kind of anarchism in there that aren't necessarily called that. And that's something that you talk about in the book too, that Black thinkers and movement workers have done anarchist work without necessarily calling it that. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what the term means and or claiming anarchism, a Black anarchism, what value there is in that, because I know you have a particular relationship to the word itself.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things there. I think the first thing to address is the fact that I have an interesting relationship with the label anarchist because I'm not attached to it. And so I say at the beginning of the text, I say that it's not something I run from and it's not something that I run to. And I appropriated that from Modibo Kadali, because I think that Modibo gets called an anarchist a lot, but that's not something he necessarily lays claim to. And so one time I was talking with him and he said that to me. He said, I don't run from anarchism, but I don't run to it either. And I kind of adapted that as my outlook. And so what I mean by that is anarchism for me, even Black anarchism, is not the point. The point is liberation. And I think that Black anarchism has amazing insights that give us important direction to try to come closer to liberation. So with regard to Black people, you know, Zoe Samudzi and I wrote The Anarchism of Blackness, and that led to us writing As Black as Resistance, and that leads to this book. What we were talking about in The Anarchism of Blackness, at least one of the core insights of that essay, was the fact that Black people have always engaged in these anarchic struggles across the Americas and across the world. And that is something that doesn't require people to lay claim to anarchism as a set of politics. People have made movements, organizations, and waged fights that didn't require them to lay claim to anarchism or have some sort of ideological devotion. And many of those things precede anarchism as a political ideology. So when we look at it that way, it tells you that claiming anarchism is not something that has to happen in order for people to do that sort of work or to do things that are going to make conditions better. I think the most important thing is creating movements that have the principles of anarchism, not laying claim to anarchism as an identity. The last thing I would want to do is try to encourage people to have this sort of rigid, unbending loyalty to dogma and to doctrine rather than the principles that make those things appealing in the first place. So I think that that's what's most important.
Yeah, like one of the ways I relate to anarchism is that like it teaches us to let go of things that don't serve us or that aren't useful to us, and should sort of teach us how to dissolve things. And I think that would have to include anarchism itself as a label. And that, when I was listening to you talk also about the European tradition, it made me think about today how like where there's another blind spot for like, say, white anarchists in the kind of inclusion of a analysis of racial capitalism, of the history of Black struggle. Anarchists are so often wanting to dissolve identities as like this kind of effect of like a liberal neoliberal state, and yet like cling to this idea of anarchism as a kind of identity, and to such an extent that it excludes people like being able to find an entry point into the work itself.
Yes, exactly.
In a way, it seems like some of those blind spots from the classical anarchism that you were talking about persist, just in a kind of like a new form almost.
Yeah, they do.
So going back to kind of the history, you differentiate Black anarchism from other Black power movements, but you're also kind of drawing the connections between them. And one of the things you talk about in the book is Black nationalism, also Black capitalism. And these are two kind of attempts to like find empowerment for Black communities. Now, your book is like totally critical of nations and states, but you also caution against kind of just like dismissing Black nationalism or Black nationalist movements, and also specifically try to differentiate between Black nationalism and like the white supremacist state and that nationalism. So I was wondering if you could talk like what are your thoughts about like what Black nationalism, what role it plays, and like how there might be potential collaboration, and if you want to talk too just about like the threat of nationalism and more generally.
Yeah, well, there are different types of nationalism. And when we're thinking about Black nationalism, you have revolutionary nationalism and you have reactionary nationalism. And I think that both need to be wrestled with. I don't make a distinction between them in the book because I find troubling currents in both. However, I don't compare Black nationalism that utilizes troubling and even homogenizing rhetoric in any form to white supremacy that it does it in response to. So, for example, I talk about Garvey in the text, and he said that he was the first fascist. He said that Benito Mussolini got fascism from him. And, even though he said that he was the first fascist, did he do what Benito Mussolini did? No, he didn't. I don't think that Black fascism is impossible or non-existent. There are certainly Black fascists now, and there have been historically, but it's important to observe what they're responding to and what their intentions are. There are parallels and distinctions. And I wrote about this some years back, actually, with regard to the Nation of Islam, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'm thinking about the Nation of Islam's Black nationalism specifically. The Southern Poverty Law Center used to have them. I'm not sure if they still do. I think that they took them off, but they used to have them on their hate group listing. And I always found that disturbing because white supremacists have always run this country, and you can't compare that and equate it with Black nationalisms that develop using rhetoric and reasoning that is similar to white supremacists. In the book, I'm arguing that before it gets to that point, we have to stop now and observe history. We have to not glorify everything and depart from this idea that we're all going to fall under the formation of a nation. The nation and the state are different things, but what many Black nationalisms lend to is the idea of a Black nation state. And that's not something that comes with no risk for violence, because there's no essential innocence, as Paul Gilroy says in his paper, Black Fascism, that makes this endeavor holier just because we're Black. So I quote Césaire in the text as well, saying, one of the values invented by the bourgeoisie in former times that was, went throughout the world was man. And he says, we've seen what happened with that. And he said the other was the nation. So this idea that the nation and this idea of the state, even in a Black form, is something that these are things are going to liberate us. This isn't ours. It's not ours. Like, to say that this is something that we can even use in this way is destructive. We're talking about trying to lay claim to ideas and to forms that we really shouldn't be trying to own. And so if we look at history and we even study, post-colonial independence movements, it helps us see the atrocity that can occur even in the name of self-described liberatory state socialist ventures and nation building. It's not something that is just this, hey, this is going to work, this is always good. It's not that simple. And I'm bothered by people who treat it that way without being honest about a lot of the history and atrocity and really horrific things that have been done in the name of nation building and state building. We have to observe that honestly.
Yeah. And, one of the things that you iterate in your book in a few different places is that like the stuff that we do has to not only like serve survival, but like struggle against, capitalism and the state. And we could think like that Black nationalism and Black capitalism, both as like things that come out of Black movement organizing, have also been like not necessarily like there have been white people in power who've been like, yeah, that sounds okay. It's like not as big a threat as like something that's fully autonomous from those power structures, which I think is sort of like in line with what you were just saying about like not owning those terms. But on the other hand, like, when you're looking at Black capitalism in the book, you talk about how the limited forms of autonomy that have existed within Black communities in the US historically, like, specifically you talk about the massacre in Tulsa in 1921, that the state, like, just will not allow that to persist because to a certain extent, it is completely inimical to the nation itself. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit now about Black capitalism and like maybe a little bit historically, and then also how it shows up today, because it comes up a lot now. And I mean, like people like Killer Mike and Beyonce are spouting it, and they also claim some sort of like, I don't know, like affinity for leftist movements in certain ways. So I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on like the role of Black capitalism.
Well, Black capitalism really comes from Nixon. And it's this idea that Black people can utilize capitalism to achieve some sort of betterment, to achieve some sort of freedom that we wouldn't be able to attain otherwise without capitalism. So I think it connects with what I was just saying in the sense that we're talking about trying to lay claim to ideas and to forms of violence that shouldn't be ours to try to lay claim to try to make use of. So Black capitalism is connected to the state and connected to this form of violence that we know is doing us a lot of harm. So to try to say that we're going to make use of it and to achieve our liberation that way is all a part of the bigger picture I'm trying to illustrate using Black anarchism. It's to say that you cannot reform and change the inner workings of violence that has been structured against us historically and then make it work for us. That's the truth with the state. That's the truth with capitalism. So we're not going to get free by saying we just need to take this pre-existing form of violence that was not created to serve us and paint it Black or paint it red or whatever the case may be, and say that it's going to be different and that it's going to be liberatory that time. The gears and the mechanisms that are built into it are going to do what they are intended to do. With regard to the state, that means having a monopoly on violence that is always self-preserving. And with capitalism, we know that that means unfettered, unrestricted desire for accumulation and exploitation. So those are not things that are going to help free us, and putting a Black label on them doesn't do any good for us either.
Yeah, and again, I think you looking to like post-colonial Africa shows that clearly. One of the things I'm hearing what you're talking about now, and this kind of connects to another question I had prepared, was sort of the way that like Blackness gets used often as this kind of monolithic or single-minded thing. But one of the chapters in your book talks about this rewriting of Black history in a kind of relationship to a lost history, a history that was stolen through a kind of mythology of what life was like for people in Africa. And you also connect this to a critique of celebrity, which is slightly different. But I was really excited that you took these things on in your book. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is that like you allow for history to be complex and messy, right? Like what you talk about is that there were African people who participated in slave trade knowingly. Like they didn't perpetrate the same institutions that the European colonists did, but it isn't this like black and white thing easily. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about this mythological use of Africa and the kind of cultural imaginary, and if you want to talk about the cult of celebrity too. And then also like, how do you think we can like not keep simplifying everything or flattening everything out and like relate to history as this messy conflagration of different stories?
Well, yeah, I think the narrative that's been created around the slave trade that you can actually see historically in many forms of like nationalism, that we are royalty fallen from grace and that we need to reclaim that royalty. It feeds into iterations of Black capitalism that we see now. That's why I bring both up, because I don't think that you can separate the two. You have someone saying that we're descended from kings and queens and that we come from royalty. What they're doing is they're feeding into the idea that wealth and royalty are what gives someone worth and value. So that's not something that you can separate from Black capitalism now, which argues the same thing in many ways, saying that by accumulating or having large amounts of wealth that we're going to be free and that we're going to be liberated. So I think that it's important to disrupt this idea that even if we were descended from kings and queens, that makes us good or that makes us better, or that's why we're deserving of respect as people. I think that we have to push back against that. So when I look at that connection, it leads me to say we have to complicate history a little bit more and be a little bit more honest if we're going to disrupt it. So we do that by looking at what actually took place during the slave trade, which is very complicated and very complex. There was a lot of different tensions. There was a lot of different relationships between African people that show us that it wasn't just, as simple as many would hope to make it. I think that people give European slave traders too much credit. They were not as efficient as I think some narratives might make them, and not as intelligent as many narratives might make them. And so I bring up the example in the text of Liberia and the formation of Liberia. And I talk briefly about the fact that formerly enslaved African people went back to the continent and engaged in some heinous, very disturbing things that included using the backing of the US state to acquire land, to force servitude, and to expand a settler process on the continent in the name of forming a Black nation. And you can't separate that history from this idea of trying to form a Black nation now and say that it doesn't matter, it doesn't compare. There's something there in that history that has to be looked at closely and observed in terms of what it means for Black capitalism, but also what it means in terms of Black nationalism. So those are things that I like to bring up because it's these overlooked aspects of history that I feel like would help people challenge this kind of automatic response of just embracing what conventional leftism has told us and conventional radicalism has told us is the way to go.
Yeah. And that probably it comes back to like the quotation from Gilroy about innocence. I don't know. I mean, even just like proclaiming that kind of innocence in a way like evacuates the way that people act. It empties people out of like the way that they actually operate in the world, which is not just like one thing or the other.
Yeah, and something that it does too that's important to note is that it actually, in my opinion, takes away from looking at Black people as people. And so it's like when you try to create this myth of this essential innocence and make Black people into this uncomplicated, homogenous group, you're actually doing something that is really, really disrespectful to Black people. And that's an important takeaway here. You're not, by trying to make Black America into this exceptional group that is innocent and that is incapable of doing anything harmful, you're actually feeding into another sort of violence and disturbing rhetoric against Black people.
This is the Final Straw Radio Show, and you're hearing author and activist William C. Anderson speak about his new book, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition, out now from AK Press. More info on Anderson and a collection of his works can be seen at williamcanderson.info.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
1 2 1 2. Tune in for another episode of Marooncast. Marooncast is a down-to-earth Black radical podcast for the people. Our host, hip-hop anarchist Simile the RBG, and sex educator and crochet artist KLC share their reflections on maroons, rebellions, womanism, life, culture, community, trap liberation, and everyday ratchetness. They deliver fresh commentary with a queer, transgender, non-conforming, fierce, funny, Southern girls, anti-imperialist, anti-oppression approach. Polyad and bullshit. Check out episodes of Marooncast on Channel Zero Network, Buzzsprout, SoundCloud, Google, Apple, and Spotify. All power to the people, all pleasure to the people. Peace.
This might actually be a good place to pivot to this question I had about popular culture, because like you talk about celebrity and stuff, but I just wonder what your thoughts on how we relate to pop culture, because it clearly is inspirational to a lot of us, you know, but it's also super captured by the structures of capitalism, individual gain, there's hierarchy. You made a really amazing playlist that goes along with your book, for example. There's a lot of political music on there too. But I'm just wondering, like, how do we engage with like this kind of cultural production from an anarchist lens? Like the history of American pop culture is a history of a lot of theft of Black cultural production. but it's also been, it's also sort of a place that, like, historically, I think Black improvement has been relegated to, and the like way that white consumers like relate to it is another version of this kind of flattening out, which is, you see that also in like writing and stuff too. Like James Baldwin talks about this a lot. So I just wonder what your like basically general thoughts are on pop culture, because it's there, it's inspiring, and it also has problems.
Yeah, I think the relationship that we have with celebrity culture is also tied to the critique I make of Black capitalism and Black capitalistic rationale. So much of the value that people put on celebrities and has to do with the wealth that they've acquired and the visibility that they've acquired, and these forms of capital that people seek out, in social ways. So when we're thinking about celebrity culture and what fame means, a lot of times that feeds into this sort of disturbing interruption that occurs within our movements, because activists end up becoming famous, organizers end up becoming famous, they become celebrities, and that ends up being a distraction and a counter-revolutionary seed in our movements, because it becomes more about what this one person who's famous, who's a famous activist, has to say and what they think because they are the leader. Black anarchism, I think, has a lot of really great insights with regard to the historical critiques around hierarchy and vanguardism, and the way that those things are problematic in our movements. So that's one aspect of it. But there's also the way that people who are famous for other things, be it music or sports or whatever entertainment, the way that those people are viewed automatically as leadership and the Black vanguard, or as someone who has some sort of expertise on activism just because they're famous. So fame also generates this kind of idea that there's an inherent intelligence and understanding that comes with the ability to accumulate. So it's to say that this person is famous, so they must know what needs to be done. They must know what we should do. We should go to them. So you end up having these celebrities who are commenting on things that they know nothing about, that they have no understanding of with regard to movements and politics. And it's really absurd, and it's really, really dangerous for our movements, because you end up having people following the words and the direction of someone just because they're famous, when they have no clue what should be done, no clue what's happening on the ground, what is happening in communities. So Black autonomous radicalism, Black anarchism, helps us to see that the people who know what needs to be happening are the people who are in those conditions, the people who are actually in their communities. It's not just about the famous activists. It's not just about the celebrity. And it's not just about the famous revolutionary. That's another point that I'm trying to make in the text, because I think that a lot of leftists would have a critique of celebrity and, stan culture and these kind of cultish relationships that people have with certain celebrities, but they have those sorts of relationships with dead revolutionaries and people who they've turned into saints, and people who they've turned into infallible politicians and leaders of the past. And so they look at these people and they have a fandom of their own with regard to the way that they view history, and they treat their favorite historical figures as perfect, flawless characters that are unquestioned because of their historical fame and because of their noteworthiness with regard to revolutions of the past and efforts and fights of the past that also escape critique because of their fame and the way that we regard them in this sort of fantastical, mythological way.
You know, it makes me think in the end, then, if we relegate our kind of politics too to this like politics of representation, which, you know, was a huge response by corporations to the uprisings of last year, George Floyd uprisings, to like, you know, be like, I don't know, Netflix Black Voices series or whatever it is. We relegate politics to that. And then also the representation that comes from like having Black artists, Black actors, Black creators of culture be the spokespeople, like you said, it ends up kind of like reifying that sort of monolithic version of race that is what the struggle is to destroy, right? By saying like someone could speak for a whole people, right, that are identified by this power structure as belonging together. So it gets talked about a lot as a root of freedom, I think, like representation, but it ends up being such a trap so often.
Ooh.
I don't know. As a teacher, like I always get caught up with like people like really stick to these things, like Megan Thee Stallion's like a feminist or something like that, and because we have such a simplified view of like what it means to like be political is just like doing like some basic form of empowerment, you know?
Yeah. So I hope that people will understand that I'm not saying that a person who's famous can't contribute to a movement. I'm also not saying that a person who's a celebrity, you know, has nothing to give or nothing to offer or can't know what's going on or have an informed analysis. That's not the case. And you know, I bring up Paul Robeson as a historical example of someone to look to that, you know, actually had a lot of amazing things to contribute to movements and had done a lot of work that is actually really impactful historically. But rather than thinking that, you know, fame is something that we should use to try to build movements, I'm saying that it's actually a problem because it feeds into a lot of hierarchical arrangements and a lot of disturbing notions of leadership and vanguardism that we need to move away from, in my opinion, because I don't think that we should be looking for some sort of elite to guide us, be it a revolutionary elite, be it an entertainment elite, or so on and so forth. I think that what's happening amongst everyday people who are self-organizing, who are building autonomy, and who know their own unique conditions, that is who needs to be focused on. The actual people doing the work in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods, and understanding their own conditions better than anyone else would try to tell them that they should be understood under the guise of whatever ideology they might do that.
One thing I hadn't really thought about a lot, but I heard you saying is that it also sort of it connects to the ideology of capitalism, that there's like meritocracy, like the people who we've heard about are there because they deserve to be there rather than like whatever luck brought them there.
Right.
And so I think that's really important to keep in mind also. And you know, like whatever becomes super mainstream and popular isn't going to give us the full story. Like it can't, if it's so popular, it can't totally be a threat anyway. And in that line, I want to go to the way that you talk about the legacy of the Black freedom movements of the mid 20th century, and how they've been rewritten into like this national story. And I'm going to quote you. You say that it's been made into a singular struggle with one line of thinking, and that you call a state project that attempts to give Black people a stake in the violence of the US. So like what is called Black history becomes everyone's story, and then a source of like pride for the US, not shame, for example. So I was just wondering about, you know, that process, if you want to talk about that historical process, and then just how it affects people today, like Black people, Black radicals, maybe differently than white radicals who are trying to struggle against racial capitalism in the state too.
Yeah, the way that this plays out and has played out for some time now historically is that the state is able to absorb the Black struggle by making it into something that is a necessary gear or mechanism to make it better. And what I mean by that is I'm saying that the way the state has absorbed and taken the story, for example, of the civil rights movement and made it about an overarching effort to just reform the intention and the direction of the US state, that's something that is completely been normalized. That's what we get in education in school and grade school. We're taught that from the earliest moments that we enter into the education system. So we look at that and see how the state is using Black history to maintain itself by saying that Black people have only ever wanted to make the state more efficient and more inclusive and better, rather than looking at the whole of Black history, where we can come into a much deeper understanding that that's not the case. And one of the examples that I bring up in the text is I talk about Lucy Parsons, again, a formerly enslaved Black woman who's an anarchist, and she's arguing against voting at a time where she doesn't even have the right to vote.
Yeah.
She couldn't even vote, and she said this is worthless. She couldn't even do it. And you look at an example like that and you say, that's amazing for Lucy to have had that insight into the symbolism and the emptiness of US electoral politics at a time when she couldn't even legally engage in it. And so that sort of history really, really pushes against this idea that Black people were just a single movement. Black radicalism was just a single movement full of people just trying to fight to be included and treated better by the state. That's not the case. So, we obviously see what this can turn into when people lean into that sort of reasoning. We have things like the 1619 Project, which said Black people made the US a democracy or something like that. But it's not a democracy. It's not a project that is even doing what it claims to be doing in terms of, again, for example, voting. We still don't have a guaranteed right to be able to cast votes as Black people in the United States. And so to say that, Black people made the US a democracy, and to feed into this idea of a more inclusive US project is actually doing a disservice to our movements by saying that the state is something that is redeemable and that can be fixed if we just keep pushing and trying to make it better. Now, whether people want to talk about it or not, that's happening also from the left in terms of and when we look at it in a more global context. What a lot of the politics that we see from many versions of state socialism are saying is that we need to just have a better state, and that there are states that we need to be trying to be more like, because if we're able to reform the state to a socialist economy, that's going to solve all of our problems. And then, traditionally, obviously, there's been the line that the state will wither away and then we'll have a stateless society and that'll be communism. But again, when we're truthful about history, and we see what has happened historically with state socialist projects, you cannot just lay blame for everything going wrong at the hands of the imperialists and empire. There have also been betrayals. There's also been atrocity. There's also been corruption. There's also been a lot of horrible things that have happened that have contributed to why those projects haven't done and achieved what we've been told by the conventional leftist narrative, that what we've been told that they were supposed to do. So when we look at those things in a much deeper way, we can begin to actually start to create and craft movements that think beyond the state, that think beyond trying to reform and fix all of these really dangerous structures that people are trying to wrestle with and lay claim to. In the context of US nationalism, so much of that takes place in really insidious ways, whether it's the classroom, the museum, or television, popular culture. We are always being told that we can lay claim and reform what's oppressing us and what's killing us. I'm trying to write against that idea across the entire spectrum and say that these things are not for us. They're not going to free us. People have already been trying to do this for long enough for us to say, this is not working, and for us to do something that transcends the left and all of our ideas of movement and left radicalism entirely and historically.
One of the convenient things about the narrative that we're talking about that kind of makes it as something that's over, which obviously, as you point out, like contradicts the material reality of people's like existence. The struggle for freedom is over, or like even if it was just limited to voting, like while the Supreme Court or whatever could say there's no longer a threat from Black people voting, it's like that is clearly not true.
One thing I would add to that too is that for me to say what I just said, for example, about state socialism and how the promises of liberation are not completely achieved by just transitioning to a socialist economy. What I'm saying there is, again, similar to looking at the history of the civil rights movement and of reform and of legislative efforts. Because what is true is that there have been gains that have been made, of course, with state socialism. But there have also been gains that have been made through reformism and through some of the liberal efforts of liberal activists in the civil rights movement. I'm not saying that reform has never achieved anything, but what I'm saying is that it's not enough. I'm not saying it's never done anything. I'm not saying that Black nationalism has never done anything. I'm not saying that state socialism has never done anything. I know that they have. I recognize as much. But what I'm saying is we have to be honest about the limitation when we see the patterns that have occurred historically and push for something greater. That's the point that I'm trying to make. So, you say these things and people, they get defensive because they know about gains that have been made. But I'm saying let's push for something much greater than the table scraps of liberalism. And let's push for something much greater than the limitations and the violence of the state.
Yeah, I mean, like, whether it's from a reformist perspective or like the authoritarian left or statist left, like there's this kind of realism that gets, quote unquote realism, that gets like invoked against our aspirations of freedom. But what you say in the book is that there have been some gains, right? And I like the way you say it, like the liberalism's table scraps, but they've also been gains that plug us in further to this killing system that's continuing to kill at the same time.
Exactly. Because when you make those gains the complete totality of everything, and when you overemphasize them to such an extent, you end up feeding into the system in such a way that you start working to preserve the system rather than exceed it and go beyond it. So when you overemphasize what has been done, you might start to lose sight of what could be done. So you can't look at the history of the civil rights movement or the Black Power movement or any movement and act like it was perfect and that it just needs to be mimicked, because it's not good to start getting caught up in this idea that that was it. That's what we need to do again. Because when you're doing that again and again and again, you're not working to break free of it.
Yeah, and I think that was beautifully said. One thought that came up, a connection that I hadn't made before, but this is, there's something that I find really important connection that you make in the book is that you take a look at the Great Migration historically as a continuation of a diaspora that's ongoing and connected to gentrification. And I'm thinking about this also, in relation to the kind of statist leftists who can't deal with like the fact of stateless people, really, if their solution is the state. You use the kind of migrant status of Black people within the U.S. and also around the world as a point of solidarity, right? And you even talk about your own radicalization through migrant defense work. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about your reading of the Great Migration, because I think it's something that maybe needs to be spoken about more, and also like how you see that kind of fitting into the current moment and places of solidarity in the ways that the state is threatening people who are most vulnerable.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that actually played a lot into my interest in anarchism too. I was really frustrated with the left, but I also was thinking about anarchism because of the fact that I was doing this organizing work that made me think a lot about citizenship and the state. And in the immigrant rights movement, I had gotten involved because I understood that I was not a citizen. I was taught that growing up. My parents told me, you're not just a second class citizen. You're really not considered a citizen at all. And I internalized that in a way growing up that became a part of my politics now and my understanding and thinking around statelessness and the ways that Black people experience it across the Americas. With regard to all of that, I know that in the immigrant rights movement, there is a lot of subtle and overt racism against Black people. And Black people are not the face of the immigrant rights movement. Despite experiencing disproportionate rates of deportation and incarceration, Black people are not seen as undocumented or immigrant or as migrants. And what that ends up doing is it takes away from a type of solidarity and a type of struggle that could be built. It actually undermines that movement significantly. And I used to try to point that out in that movement, where people didn't really have a lot of understanding of why I was participating. And I was trying to find the language to explain this back then, but it didn't always come out the way that I can express it now, because I had to take a lot of time to think and develop the understanding that I now can claim. But you hear people talk about migration struggles and they totally neglect the Great Migration. And to be more specific, they neglect the Great Migrations. There is more than one that has occurred with regard to Black America, forced and otherwise. They're all forced in the sense that we're talking about, or I'm talking about, migrations of Black people who had to leave because of, maybe they got priced out or gentrification happened now. And then historically, you had migrations during enslavement where Black people were forced to move en masse to other places in the country because of the demands of the slaveholding class and what their desires were for agricultural production. So when you look at that history and pay attention to all of the times that Black people have had to move and have been pushed out of places and forced around this country, it creates a pretty stunning example of what we can see on a global scale that's happening domestically which is there is no real place to run to find this sort of like absolute safe haven and asylum that we can lay claim to that's going to protect us from state violence. And so when you bring that into the history of Black anarchism, you see someone like Lorenzo who's fleeing to other countries looking for that asylum and not finding it. Lorenzo's story is one of many. I highlight his specifically because I'm talking about Black anarchism, but there have been plenty of other times where Black people have historically gone to other countries looking for liberation, looking for freedom, and did not find them, including under state socialism. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's happened both domestically and internationally. So I'm trying to draw that connection there. Obviously, domestically, we're talking about under the oppression of the US state. But then when you start thinking outside of the US state, there's a discussion to be had about what Black people and migration tell us about the state generally here within the US context, but also outside of the US. There's something there that needs to be unpacked. Very, very much needs to be observed deeply and internalized.
Right. I appreciate in the book that you draw the connection that those conditions that force Black migration within the United States aren't different in kind that forces the other migrations around the globe, whether it's Black people or not, but it does include Black people. And as you like rightly point out, that's often overlooked. But like sort of building on that idea that you said came from your parents too, in terms of your like relationship to citizenship as a Black person in the US, that's something that you know, going back to your work with Zoe Samudzi and the idea of Black and anarchy, that being Black in the US kind of positions someone into being potentially this like internal threat to the coherence of the state that doesn't necessarily translate into like radical organizing or radical consciousness. But like one of the things that I see you really working on in the book is like, how do you move from that space of being potentially a threat by definition from the state to actually working towards like, you know, generalizing that ungovernability or like whatever a process of radicalization is? How do we like get people to see those conditions and then politicize their actions? And you frame this also just in terms of like the Black Panther survival programs, which weren't just like feeding people, but also politicizing them. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what insight you've gained about individual radicalization from a position of like Blackness, and also how to frame the survival programs that you talk about Black people having been doing historically for generations, centuries even, but like how to frame those as explicitly antithetical to the state.
Yeah, so I think that one of the best things that we can do is discourage people from positively identifying with the US project. Mm-hmm. And we can do that by illustrating all of the different times that state violence has, you know, targeted Black people historically. We can do that by talking about statelessness. We can do that by talking about how Black people have been positioned as inherently seditious, inherently, you know, quote unquote alien, or inherently criminal. Those sorts of realizations help us highlight that this is not something that is going to be fixed through reformism. And when we were writing The Anarchism of Blackness and talking about the way that Black people have had to work and think outside of the state and engage in anarchistic practices without laying claim to anarchism as a set of politics necessarily, mm-hmm. What we are saying there is that highlighting those examples historically and talking about how they occur repeatedly throughout history, even today, that is telling us and that is informing us about what the state actually is and what it means with regard to Black people. So rather than trying to reform it or seize it and lay claim to it and reform it, we're having a discussion about what we can actually do to delegitimize it in our minds and move away from trying to make it ours or make it better or make it more efficient. So it's important to advocate for that, in my opinion, because if you get caught up in this idea that you can actually reform the state, what ends up happening is you get this sort of overarching kind of patriotism that kind of creeps in there and starts encouraging people to try to find value in what it is they're putting efforts towards reforming and trying to fix. Because if you're doing all that work, you might start saying, well, this is something that's redeemable and it's something that can just be adjusted. And so that's one of the things I think is really important for anarchists to challenge specifically, because you hear a lot of conversations among anarchists and around mutual aid about, you hear a lot of people saying, like, I'm not trying to let the state off the hook, or I'm not trying to fill in the gaps for what the state should be doing. But I think that what we were trying to get at back then with the anarchism of Blackness was saying the state is not on the hook. The state is not, it's not malfunctioning. It's not doing something wrong when it commits state violence against us. That is a part of its core function. It has a monopoly on violence, and it creates a system of haves and have-nots. It has a ruling class. It has core intentions that tell it to do what it's doing, that give it instruction and give it life through doing those things. So rather than trying to fix them, like, we should actually be encouraging people to remove ourselves from the idea that it has something for us in it that we just haven't discovered yet.
Do you have any thoughts how to make our mutual aid projects like not co-optable? Because where they do fill in the gaps in terms of like making people survive, and I'm thinking like in disaster relief, and particularly in this like long COVID period where there's been a lot of survival programs put in place by people, and they may be done by anarchists, but like I don't necessarily see how they're a threat. Just like a lot of disaster relief work around hurricanes and stuff could be claimed by the state after the fact. I don't know. I mean, that's something you talk about in the book, that it's something that we need to do. And yeah, I just would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that one of the most important things to observe is the history of revolutionary intercommunalism of the Black Panther Party. That's one of the reasons I bring that up in the text. And that's where we get survival programs. That's where that comes in. So survival programs and mutual aid are obviously distinct and they have different meanings. I'm not trying to conflate the two. But one thing I've been, saying when I talk about this book is that these are both things that work and they can complement one another. And because of people's dedication to dogma, to ideology, to doctrine, they'll look past things that could work to their benefit. So the intercommunalism of the Panthers and the survival program is something that offers a lot of valuable, good history, good organizing, good work that can be done to actually be much more effective now. And I don't think that people have a real deep understanding of what it was that the Panthers were doing with intercommunalism and with the survival program. What needs to be done is going to be specific. First and foremost, I want to say that it's going to be specific to every community. And I'm not going to try to be a person that is doing exactly what I try to speak against, which is saying that there's a one size fits all approach that is going to, save everybody. I'm not going to talk like that, or at least I'm going to try to avoid talking like that. But one of the things that we can see with the survival program, for example, was the Panthers were creating a systemic approach to meeting the material needs of people in communities across the country and doing things that were absolutely necessary to sustain everyday life for Black people. And they were not just doing it to just be doing it. That's an important thing to note there, because you can have a program or you can have a mutual aid group and just, give out food or give out clothes or, do whatever the case may be. But if you are not politicizing that work and undermining capitalism and talking about state violence and rejecting and fighting back against it while you're doing that work and through that work, then that takes away from what you're doing. Because if I give somebody some groceries and say, hey, here's some groceries, I know that you need some food, it's not the same as giving somebody some groceries that have some propaganda in there that say, I'm giving you these groceries because of this capitalist system creating a problem where you don't have access to them in the first place and oppressing you. Those are two completely different things. So you can be giving someone groceries every week, but if you're giving groceries with that intention and with the political education and the radical information you can distribute with it, it's a much different thing, And so these efforts have to be politicized, and they have to be radical in a way that actually is doing the work that makes it a threat. The Panthers were targeted because their work was a threat.
Yeah.
And so what is going to make our work threatening? What is going to make us ungovernable, to quote Lorenzo?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that has to do with the political intention to actually undermine the state and to undermine the efforts of the state to maintain power. So you can't just do it just to be doing it. There has to be that intention behind it. And I think that that's one of the most important thing. And then when you look at different Black anarchist approaches, one of the things that's going to come up is, okay, if everybody does start doing it with that intention, where do we go from there? And that's going to be a different answer depending on who you're talking to or depending on who you're reading in terms of Black anarchists historically.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk to somebody like Lorenzo's going to talk about dual power. He's going to talk about building dual power. And again, that takes us back into the history of Black anarchism, drawing from that which informed it, but that which it also critiques. So that dual power, that's coming from Lenin, that's coming from Lenin. And I will tell you right now, Lorenzo has plenty of criticism for Lenin, but he's drawing from dual power. And then you can talk about, Proudhon outlining, Pierre Joseph Proudhon outlining dual power before Lenin. And, there's all types of, you can keep going back with the history there. You know that it's more complicated. But Lorenzo's conception of dual power, he's drawing from Lenin and talking about building a complete economy, a complete network that is taking these efforts to actually counter the state and making them so effective that it is actually posing as a real challenge because it's connected. It's not just happening on these individual bases, sprinkled throughout the country and isolated. It's being connected in a way that actually begins to actually pose a challenge to power. And that has to happen actually globally too when we're thinking about this. This isn't just about what's happening within US borders.
Right, and that's how you pull on Huey P. Newton's intercommunalism as a kind of replacement for an internationalist thinking, as a way of linking struggles without that kind of nationalist idea. And I think that's really important. And I'm grateful to you for teaching me about that. What I'm thinking about with what you're just saying is like, okay, I'm going to characterize this as kind of like a white leftist utopian idea that defers revolution to like another time, but also is kind of like, always thinking about catastrophe as impending, like not here yet. But when you listen to Black anarchists, indigenous anarchists, there's this kind of awareness that like we're in the middle of it, right? It's not about to happen. It's been happening. And you say in the book that like the race war isn't coming, right? Like we're not just looking at white supremacists and Nazis preparing for the race war. It's here. It's here through the state, right? So I'm wondering, like, too, if kind of acknowledging that survival pending revolution doesn't mean like the revolution is always to come, but it means that like we're in the midst of it right now, maybe. How does that help us reframe these dual power, this mutual aid, the survival programs as, more effective in the moment rather than like preparatory to something that's going to come?
Yeah. Well, I'd say if we're being honest about conditions and what has to happen, there's no real choice other than to be building these programs, because if we don't, people are going to perish and people are going to suffer. And if we're honest about the fact that, the state is not for us, it's not serving us, it's not benefiting us, then there's a core truth that comes with that this system, which is ruling over our everyday lives, it is a part of the crisis that people seem to kind of have this cinematic idea of. It is a part of this crisis in the current moment. It's not something that is a destination that's far away. It's something that is here now, and it's connected to our everyday lives in this present moment. So rather than trying to portray it as something that is, this end of the world apocalyptic moment, we have to look at what's occurring on a day-to-day basis. And I would encourage people to read Professor Badura Allegra's work, because her writing on catastrophe has been pretty influential around my thinking here. But it's not something that we can just look at as a final event that's going to take place and just fall on our heads. It's something that's playing out day to day. And for us to actually work against it and to fight these systems that are dropping terror on our lives regularly, we have to recognize as much and try to undermine and work against this repetition that is playing out in this destructive way, rather than treating things as if they are going to play out in this cinematic kind of film-like fantasy way, that there's just this one explosive thing that's going to happen. A lot of the history and a lot of the events that we think of as a part of that film-like fantasy are things that have already occurred before, and are things that are going to occur much sooner than would happen in that play in our heads.
Yeah, in the book you talk about, the subtitle of the book's Black Anarchism and Abolition, and one way you define abolition is that it's one, or I don't know if this is a definition, but you say that abolition is one step within a larger project of revolution. And how you're talking about this like makes me think that it kind of changes the timeline there of revolution a little bit. Like abolition is this thing that we're doing right now within this larger horizon. I wonder if you want to talk about how you see abolition and like how it relates to a Black anarchist project too, because those words get linked, but they also seem to be distinct, right?
Well, when I was talking about abolition, I was talking about it because obviously abolition became much more widely discussed in a very, very quick amount of time. And I wanted to take abolition beyond the state for more people, because I think that what abolition meant to a lot of people when it became so much more widely discussed and embraced the way that it did during the uprisings of 2020, I think what abolition meant for a lot of people was no more police, and that's it. I was trying to complicate that in this text by saying that the police are just one aspect of state violence. They are not the entirety of it. And ultimately, if you want to get rid of state violence, you need to get rid of the state. And Black anarchism has already been having that conversation for a long time now. So I was just trying to bring abolition to that point for some people who may not have been there yet.
Right. Yeah, it's so important, I think, always to like include the state in our project of abolition, not just police, or not even just police and prisons, because they all uphold each other in a way.
And even if you were to get rid of the police, that's just one form of policing. And that's
Right.
just one form of systematic violence that the state uses to inflict terror on people domestically and globally.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, so one thing that comes up for me is, going back to kind of migration, diaspora, and the relationship of like diaspora and indigeneity. I'm Jewish. I am from a diaspora position, and specifically as a Jewish person, I'm like against Zionism as like the solution to diaspora or something, right? Because it's another violent settler state, racist settler state. But I'm also like a settler in the US. So I was just wondering, from a Black anarchist perspective, how you might relate kind of like the conditions of diaspora and the support of indigenous struggle without turning them into like some kind of argument between the two, which I see also happening sometimes. Because like a distinction that has been drawn between like the conditions of Blackness and the conditions of indigenous people in the US is like landlessness and then a stolen land or something like that. And I'm just wondering what you think are connections of support and solidarity between a kind of Black anarchist perspective and support of indigenous struggles in the US and worldwide. And I was framing it through a question of diaspora, because like diaspora and indigeneity could be seen as some kind of like oppositional position. If it doesn't really make sense to you, that's fine. I guess I'm struggling a little bit how to articulate it. It's something I'm like interested in. There's a question there for me, but I'm maybe not articulating it well.
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing that happens that people don't see Black people as indigenous people in a way that parallels what I was describing with the way that Black people are not seen as migrants or immigrants, and so on and so forth. And so I think to put them in proper conversation, you just have to recognize that Black people can occupy that category and do occupy that category, and to have a more complete understanding of indigeneity rather than trying to make Blackness and indigeneity mutually exclusive. So when I'm talking about bringing a more full and complete understanding to Black people and Blackness and migration, then what happens is you start doing the work of getting away from undermining what could be a stronger movement when you have that more comprehensive understanding of all of the intricacies that can take place under a given under that term. So the same way I was talking about how the immigrant rights movement undermines itself by excluding and having racism against Black people, rather than, seek to be included and to diversify, just being honest about what is actually taking place. It's not just about include me in this movement and make me a part of it and I'll have representation, rather than saying, why is this movement not including, and why is it not recognizing this, and then trying to do better and go beyond and push for more. So I think that the same thing could happen for sure with indigenous anarchisms, rather than having this conflict around inclusion.
So the other thing I would love to hear you talk about is the title of your book, because I just think it's a really beautiful, evocative title. And I think maps, you're critical of the nation, but in the title and in your writing, there's this idea maybe of like a nation beyond state. And like the map too is like, has been a tool of colonialism, but also it holds some kind of mystery. And I'm just wondering what you're saying with the title and what your inspiration here and how that phrase, the nation on no map, frames Blackness in relation to the state.
Well, the title of the book, it comes from Gwendolyn Brooks' poem about the gang that was once called the Blackstone Rangers. And she has this line in the poem where she says, their country is a nation on no map. When I first read that poem, I feel like it really stuck out to me. I was just like that. It's just like, this is beautiful, the way that she she constructed that. And it was something that I included in As Black as Resistance when we were talking about the complexities of gangs in that text. And so part of what's being said with the title is that there is an acknowledgement of that statelessness that is there in that phrasing, the nation on no map. But there is also another thing that I'm trying to do, which is to say that, you know, what if we're not only a nation on no map? What if we're not a nation? And what if we're not on a map? Because we know that those things are not, again, that those things are not for us. And so it's really about acknowledging our position, but letting that lead to more questions about why that position is what it is in the first place. And so I'm not trying to advocate for nationhood in any way. I'm actually questioning it with that title. So I appreciated Gwendolyn Brooks' poem as well, because I think that gangs and organizations that form on the streets have a lot to say and inform a lot of my thinking about how things could potentially look in the future in terms of the way conflict I feel is going to play out in this country. And I think that a lot of the left ignores and doesn't recognize gangs and doesn't think and try to approach gangs in the way that needs to happen. But there's a lot of revolutionary history there that, again, you know, so much of this is about overlooked history. So, you know, there's a lot of revolutionary history there that has to be acknowledged. And I wasn't trying to kind of go back down that path because I feel like it was already covered a lot in As Black as Resistance. But I was trying to bring back that thread.
Yeah, I think that's super important to what you're saying, kind of looking to gangs and how it gets overlooked. But yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And you know, in the book, you also have included photographs, and I just wonder if you can talk about how you see them interacting with the text. They're like beautiful and haunting, clearly. So yeah, just wondering how you chose them, or what their role is, you think, in the text.
Yeah, those are just all my photos. I took those photos over the course of years. There were just a lot of different moments, you know, when I was writing this text that I saw something and I took a photo, and I was, you know, writing the text and thinking about how those photos and what I was taking an image of, how it relates. So, for example, you know, somewhere I think within the chapter where I'm talking about the narrative around kings and queens and the mythology and the way that history is kind of mythologized to make Black people into all descendants of a sort of African nobility. I thought about that with regard to a slave rebellion reenactment that I attended in Louisiana. And I took a picture of one of the reenactors on his horse, and I put it in that chapter because I think that is absolutely connected to what I'm saying. I wrote an essay about that, you know, also exists on Hyperallergic. I wrote that, but I thought about it in its connection in the sense that, you know, the way that I was seeing this sort of idea that by, you know, glorifying this this former slave rebellion, that it would restore kind of a certain pride and a certain revolutionary spirit in Black people. It made me wonder about the connections between the past and what we try to communicate through emphasizing certain history. And I thought that it was really interesting to witness that at the slave rebellion reenactment that I went to. So I put that picture there just because I thought it was connected. I didn't go into the detail, obviously, that I went into just now, but it's just something that I was thinking about when I was there. And so many of the photos in that text, you know, like I talk about bombings, I talk about Dynamite Hill. I'm from Birmingham, so I took a picture of Angela Davis's childhood home on Dynamite Hill in Birmingham. And I also took a picture of Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham, which was also subject to that sort of violence. So they're just there to illustrate connections, but they're also there because I like to include as much imagery with my writing as possible. And I try to be very thoughtful about images with whether it's an essay or a book. There were images in As Black as Resistance, but I definitely will try to put images wherever I can because I think that they make it easier to read. I think that people like to look at things and see images while they're reading. And I think that it also helps kind of try to take away from this idea that the type of writing that I'm doing has to be, really plain and not interactive. So I'm trying to just kind of make it more fun to read something that's not necessarily a fun subject, if that makes sense. And maybe fun isn't the right word, but just at least just make it more interactive for people,
Yeah, no, I totally get that, what you're saying. And I mean, I really appreciate you unpacking, that particular connection. But it's like an invitation almost to the reader because it's kind of sparks your imagination to be like, well, what is this picture and what is it doing here and how does it relate to the text? And it kind of invites that interactive reading, I think.
Yeah, I also I write about photography a decent amount. I have multiple essays out there in the world about photography that I've done with Hyperallergic and the British Journal of Photography. So photography is really important to me as an art form, but also something that can be violent and used for really horrible and disturbing purposes. So I think about photography a lot, and it's always something that like music is just a big part of my life and my work. And I try to, interact with it whenever I'm doing these things.
Yeah. Well, you've entertained a lot of questions and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and think about all this stuff and kind of, present some of the ideas from your book to the listeners. So is there anything else that you want to talk about or cover that we didn't get a chance to?
Not at the moment. Just want to say thank you for this interview and for reading the book. And thanks to anybody that's listening or reading the book or thinking about reading the book. I'm really grateful for all of it. So everyone, that's listening, be safe and be good in your community and try to do what you can, and solidarity.
Yeah, I really appreciate your thinking and your work, and I think it's a huge contribution. So thank you for taking the time, and we'll include in the show too how people can connect with your work and you if you want.
I appreciate that.
That was co-host Scott's interview with author and activist William C. Anderson on his new book, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition.
All the following links are HTTPS, just so you know. Thanks to all the folks who support the show in various ways. You can support us by rating and reviewing us on Google, Apple Podcasts, or other streaming sites. You can contact us to give feedback or suggestions on show content, as well as follow and share our content on social media via the links found at tfsr.wtf/tree. Check out our transcribed interviews available for easy printing as zines, a printable catalog of our available zines for sending into prisoners or sharing otherwise at tfsr.wtf/zines. You're welcome to share that text and let us know if you translate any of those interviews, and we'll happily share those as well. You can support a transcription by purchasing t-shirts, stickers, and other things, or send us one-time or recurring donations, including subscribing to our Patreon, via the links at tfsr.wtf/support. Finally, you can get us on your local radio airwaves. More info on that is at tfsr.wtf/radio. Thank you for all the support and solidarity.